One thing you should know about me is I'm old. I've been around a while. Long enough to make a top 20 list of my favorite coasters in the summer of 2002. A list that I still have today. Every year I update my top 50 coasters based on the new stuff I've ridden, so you've probably seen my most recent top 10. And thanks to the parks being closed this year, that list is still the same. With 425 credits, that list is pretty solid. But when you turn the clock back 18 years when my coaster count was just 70, without a lot of the world-class coasters being built yet, that list is interesting to say the least. I'm also going to look at my top 10 list from 2013 after I doubled my coaster count from 70 to 140. So here we go. This is how my top 10 list has evolved over the years. Let's look at my 2002 list, numbers 20 through 11, because I have it, and because why not? To make this list, you had to be in the top 29% of coasters that I'd ridden at the time. So at number 20 is kind of an honorable mention. It's the Beast at Paramount's Kings Island. I did not love this the first time I rode it. It hurt like hell. But I knew the legend of the Beast, so I liked it for its history. On my current list, it's at number 109. It started in my top 29% and is now in my top 26%, which makes sense because I've gotten some great rides on it over the last 4 years. Number 19 was Gemini at Cedar Point. Back in 2002, the coaster collection at Cedar Point was a lot less impressive than it is now, so you'd think that Gemini would be higher, but I guess I wasn't all that impressed. I actually consider it as one of the more fun rides at Cedar Point these days. On opening day 2018, this was actually the coaster that I rode the most out of anything else in the park. I bumped it all the way up to number 59. It started in my top 28%, and now it sits in my top 14%. Classic ride, don't remove it. Number 18 was Flight of Fear at Paramount's Kings Island. Little 14-year-old me must have been really impressed with this, because it's a ride that I can do without when I go to Kings Island or Kings Dominion these days. It's always a one and done, and I don't get much enjoyment out of it, so now it's ranked at number 218. So it started in my top 26%, and now it's in the lower half of my credits, in the top 52%. Number 17 was Roar at Six Flags Marine World. I only got to ride this during my 2001 trip to the park since I didn't come back until 2018, and at the time the ride was only 2 years old, so it must have been running pretty smooth. Since then, I got to ride Roar at Six Flags America in 2008 and 2019, and it's one of my least favorite coasters of all time. It's hard to judge this one in 2020 standards, but where this ride was in my top 25 in 2002, it's now in my top 62% as it ranks at number 261. Number 16 was Desperado at Buffalo Bills Resort and Casino. This used to run more consistently. I even spent a weekend here in 2001 just marathoning it, along with the log flume and the drop tower that used to be right outside the back door. If you were wondering if it was smoother when it was only 7 years old, it wasn't. It beat you up pretty good, which is probably why it was only at number 16. It was top 23% back then, now it's top 45%, checking in at number 190. It's got a really stupid layout, and it hurts, but I still have to ride it every time I go. I just hope it reopens again, because it seems to be on its last leg. Number 15 was Wicked Twister at Cedar Point. In my defense, it was brand new in 2002. It wasn't my first impulse, because I did ride V2 at Marine World the year before, but the huge double twisted spikes were a big deal, and impulse coasters were cool back then. I still like this ride, but where it was in my top 22% then, it's now in my top 36% at number 153. Number 14 was Deja Vu at Six Flags Magic Mountain. This was also a pretty new coaster, and really the first coaster I ever tracked from announcement to construction to opening, and I was there on its opening day in 2001. These giant inverted boomerangs are great. Even though this was moved to New England and ruined with bad trains, it doesn't take away how much fun Deja Vu was when it was at Magic Mountain. It was top 20% then. Now it's right there in my top 21%, coming in at number 87. Number 13 was Accelerator at Knott's Berry Farm. I'm really shocked that this is as low as number 13. This was another new for 2002 coaster, and I honestly don't understand why I have a bunch of other coasters ranked above it. Today, it's really close to my top 50, coming in at number 55. So it started off in my top 19%, and it's now in my top 13%. That launch is still my favorite of all time, and the airtime over the top hat is great. even if that's pretty much all the ride is. Number 12 was Top Gun at Paramount's Kings Island. My first visit to the park in 2002 wasn't all that great, but I walked away thinking that Top Gun, the Aero suspended coaster now known as the Bat, was the best coaster in the park. It's still my favorite suspended coaster, but luckily, Cedar Fair has improved this park so much that nobody has to talk about the Bat being the best coaster in the park anymore. It started in my top 18%, and now it sits in my top 26% at number 110. Number 11 was Space Mountain at Disneyland. I've had some amazing rides on this back in junior high and high school, and I was really high on it. I still love it every time I ride it. It feels like it's going way faster than it is, with those intense turns and sudden drops. But did I really have this ranked over Accelerator? I still respect it, ranking it at number 154, so it went from my top 16% to my top 37%. Okay, finally to the top 10, and at number 10, we have California Screamin' at Disney's California Adventure. It was really cool to get to this brand new park in October of 2001, and have one of the world's longest coasters waiting for me. A world-class Intamin launch coaster built to look like an old wooden coaster. It's not the most intense or a great ride, which is why it's not higher on my list. And even today, it's still got a place in my top 100 at number 86. So it went from my top 15% to my top 21%. Number 9 was Raptor at Cedar Point. This was my first experience with one of the big-time B&M inverts. This was already a legend when I first rode it, when it was only 8 years old. It did not disappoint, and it's still one of my favorite coasters today. This is the first coaster that's still in my top 50, at number 35, so it improved from my top 13% up to my top 9%. Number 8 was X-Flight at Six Flags Worlds of Adventure. My first experience with a Vekoma Flying Dutchman was awesome. My biggest regret was cutting the sleeves off my X-Flight shirt and throwing it in the trash once it ripped too much. That was dumb, but the ride was awesome. And I enjoyed it just about as much as Firehawk when I went to Kings Island in 2016 and its final year in 2018. These Flying Dutchmen did not stand the test of time as well as some other coasters, so I dropped it a little. It started in my top 12%, and now it sits in my top 19% at number 79. Number 7 was Goliath at Six Flags Magic Mountain. This is the saddest one on the list, but for a long time, I thought Goliath was the best coaster in the world. I think I held this opinion through 2000 and for most of 2001. I was really a Goliath fanboy. Now, I can't stand this thing. I can't stand its stupid shallow drop, I can't stand its pointless turnaround, its airtimeless airtime hill, its killer mid-course brake run, or its spaghetti bowl section. I really wish Magic Mountain could have gotten a B&M hyper just like Great America and Great Adventure did around the same time. It was in my top 10%. Now it's in my top 53% at number 222. I have this ranked below Lightning Racer, and Lightning Racer sucks. Number 6 was Raven at Holiday World. My first trip to Holiday World in 2002 was awesome. It was such a cool park back then when it just had its 2 coasters in the Halloween section. I loved Raven. It was only 7 years old at the time. It had great airtime, it ran pretty smooth, and it was one of the better wooden coasters that I had ridden. I can't say that anymore. It fell after I finally got back to the park in 2016, and it fell even more after my 2018 trip. So it was in my top 9% back then, and now it's in my top 24% at number 98. Number 5 was X at Six Flags Magic Mountain. It was big, pink, and yellow back then, and it was less than a year old. We were so hyped for it, and even though we had to wait, it lived up to that hype. It got the overhaul that it needed in 2008 when it became X2, and now it's just as good as it was back when it was new. I had this in my top 8%, and now it's in my top 3% at number 11. Number 4 was Medusa at Six Flags Marine World. I was so looking forward to riding a floorless coaster when I went to Marine World in 2001, and I had read so much about Medusa. So this was the coaster that I was looking forward to most when I went up there. It was brand new, and it did not disappoint. This was my first floorless, and I've ridden all of the others in the country since, and I still have this ranked in the top 2 of the floorless coasters in the country. It still finds a place in my top 50 at number 43. So even though it's not in my top 6% anymore, it's still in my top 11%. Number 3 was Magnum XL200 at Cedar Point, and honestly, I'm surprised that I had it this high. I don't remember loving it. Obviously, it's a hypercoaster, so it was a big deal. But I don't think I got a great ride on it in 2008, and it wasn't until 2016 that I really started to appreciate it. But it's so good to see it so high at number 3 here, in my top 5%, and it's still in my top 5% at number 18. Number 2 was Millennium Force at Cedar Point. And honestly, how could I not? Millie was the legend of all coasters back then. We talk about it being iconic today, but it was even more dominating back in 2002. It was one of only 2 coasters that I gave a perfect 10 out of 10 score to. It's the reason I went to Cedar Point back then, and it did not disappoint. But there was still one coaster that I thought was better. Millennium Force was in my top 3%, and now it's in my top 4% at number 16. Number 1 was Ghost Rider at Knott's Berry Farm. This was one of my first coasters, and I didn't have this in my top spot for a long time. But over the course of 2 years or so, I realized that this was my favorite. It was really when I turned from GP to enthusiast, realizing that this wooden coaster was the best coaster that I had ridden, despite not being the tallest or the fastest. It was my number 1 back then, and it still holds a spot in my top 10 at number 8. Before moving on to my 2013 list, I want to point out a few coasters that I feel like I should have given more love, and maybe found a spot for on this list. First, Batman Night Flight at Six Flags Worlds of Adventure. This is now at King's Dominion as Dominator, ranked 76th on my overall list, but it didn't resonate with me as a great ride at the time. Also, Speed the Ride at NASCAR Cafe at the Sahara. This was Vegas's best coaster, and I marathoned it at least once back in 2002. I have it at number 126 now, and I'm surprised that it did not crack this list. Finally, a coaster that I love more now than ever before. Viper at Magic Mountain failed to make this list, and it's now up at number 105. A couple notable coasters that did not make this list for a good reason are Legend at Holiday World, which I always thought had a boring layout and is now getting really rough, as well as Son of Beast at Paramount's Kings Island. Despite being an infamous legend, it was not a good ride experience. Fast forward 11 years, on to 2013. I wasn't much of an enthusiast in the years between 2002 and 2013, but I managed to double my coaster count from 70 to 140, mainly thanks to an East Coast vacation in 2008 where I hit a bunch of parks. And also, my first trip to Six Flags Great America in 2013, during a trip to Chicago. Some honorable mentions of rides that I added to my count, but couldn't crack the top 10. Hollywood Rip Ride Rocket at Universal Orlando. I had so much fun on this thing during my honeymoon in 2012, but it wasn't quite a top 10 ride. On that same trip, I also got to experience Dragon Challenge, the pair of inverts that were just removed in 2017. Also, Superman Ride of Steel at Six Flags America and Volcano the Blast Coaster at King's Dominion did not make this list. And I also rode both those coasters on my 2008 trip. So let's dive into my top 10 as of 2013. At number 10 was Tatsu at Six Flags Magic Mountain. This came along when I was working at the park, and that was by far the craziest summer I had ever seen at Magic Mountain. And this was my first B&M flying coaster. I loved X-Flight, and this took that flying experience to the next level. I still can't believe Six Flags built this thing. It was top 8% in 2013, and has fallen down to the top 17%, now at number 72. Number 9 was Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point. This came to Cedar Point the year after I first went there, but I got to ride it in 2008. And even to this day, it's one of the most intense experiences on any coaster, hitting that 120 mph mark. It's a rush, but it's a one-trick pony. I had this in my top 25 as recently as 2017, but after I picked up a bunch of credits in 2018, I dropped it out of my top 50. So it was in my top 7% in 2013. Now it's top 13% at number 52. Number 8 was Maverick at Cedar Point. This was another coaster that I rode for the first time on my trip in 2008 when it was just in its second year. My first ride on this was with those hard over-the-shoulder restraints, but I was still impressed with this style of coaster that I had never seen before. I remember getting one ride that first time and waiting in a huge line, but it was worth it. It was top 6% in 2013, and it hasn't fallen that far, now in the top 8% at number 32. Number 7 was Nitro at Six Flags Great Adventure. This was my second B&M Hyper, and it's something that I followed closely when it was being built in 2001. It was really a big deal back then, and I was excited to get on it during my first visit to the park in 2008. It was top 5% back then, and is held steady in my top 6% at number 23. Number 6 was Raven at Holiday World. I hadn't ridden it since 2002, and I wouldn't get another ride until 2016, so I still had the idea that it was an elite ride. Number 5 was Millennium Force. It dropped a bit from my number 2 spot because of 3 other coasters that I added to my list. But my rides in 2008 were just as good as my rides in 2002, so it deserved to stay in my top 5. Number 4 was Apollo's Chariot at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. This was my first B&M Hyper, and it was an amazing experience. I had never ridden anything with floater airtime that good, ever. This was the first park I went to on that 2008 trip, and this became my favorite steel coaster. I wouldn't get back on this for 11 years, but I came back in 2019 and had some very lackluster rides, making me drop it out of my top 10 and all the way down to number 44. So it went from my top 3% and now is in my top 11%. Number 3 was Raging Bull at Six Flags Great America. My trip to Chicago in 2013 was not a coaster trip, but having been an enthusiast 10 years earlier, I was still interested in visiting the park and riding the coasters that I knew so much about back then. Raging Bull was even more amazing than Apollo's Chariot. I still love Raging Bull more than I probably should, and I've dropped it a bit on my list, mainly thanks to RMC. But it was top 3% back then, and it's still in my top 3%, coming in at number 10. Number 2 was Ghost Rider at Knott's Berry Farm. I ride this a lot because it's only 60 miles from my house. It was the coaster that I had ridden the most before Twisted Colossus. So even when I didn't consider myself an enthusiast anymore, I still went to Knott's a lot in the mid-2000s, all the way up until 2010. I actually went 7 years without riding this between 2010 and 2017, so I missed the period of time when it got rough, which caused the GCI retracking. By 2013, it was still an ultra elite coaster for me. It wasn't until 2017 that I realized that it wasn't quite as good as I remembered it. Number 1 was El Toro at Six Flags Great Adventure, and it wasn't even close. I didn't know anything about it when I went to Great Adventure in 2008, other than it was just a giant wooden coaster and it looked good. After my first ride, I immediately knew it was my number 1. I remember telling my dad on the brake run that it was the best coaster I'd ever ridden. It's still great today. I've gotten multiple rides on it in 2008, 2015, 2018, and 2019, and only Steel Vengeance outranks it today, so it still checks in at my number 2 spot. So let's quickly run through my current top 10 as of June 2020. Number 10, Raging Bull. Number 9, Mako. Number 8, Ghost Rider. Number 7, Twisted Colossus. Number 6, Diamondback. Number 5, Lightning Rod. Number 4, Wicked Cyclone. Number 3, Fury 325. Number 2, El Toro. And number 1, Steel Vengeance. Here's the comparison from 2002 to 2013 to 2020. I would love to come back to this in 5 years or so, after maybe visiting Europe, Asia, and Australia, and see how today's list holds up. I've pretty much ridden all of the good stuff in North America, so it's time to branch out. Of course, keeping in mind that bigger and better stuff will always be added in the future. So that's all I have for now. Let me know what you think of these lists in the comments below. And if you have a top 10 list from your early years as a coaster fan, how much has it changed over the years? Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.